Chris Nowinski, PhD, is co-founder and CEO of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to solving the concussion and CTE crisis by advancing the study, treatment, and prevention of the effects of brain trauma in athletes, veterans, and other at-risk groups. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show today. I wanted to start by having you tell us, if you would, about your lived experience as it relates to concussive injury.
Sure. It doesn't start until I was in my early 20s, and I was wrestling for WWE, and I got kicked in the head by a guy named Bubba Ray Dudley in a match that gave me a throbbing headache, and I suddenly forgot how the rest of the match was supposed to go. Unfortunately, at that time, though, I didn't realize that those were signs of concussion, so I kept wrestling and lying about what I went through, sort of minimizing it, and continued to wrestle with a headache for 5 weeks until I developed REM behavior disorder. I developed sleepwalking. And at that point, I suddenly was honest and said, my head's been hurting for 5 weeks. I think I did something, and learned it was a concussion, and I developed post-concussion syndrome, and I never really became the same. And even learned over time that when I learned what a concussion was, I'd been getting them throughout playing football at Harvard and earlier times in my wrestling career, and just considered that to be normal. Double vision, blacking out, sky changing colors. I didn't know any better.
So that's post-concussion syndrome, those symptoms?
Right. For me, it was headaches for years. The sleepwalking, I had to take medication for a very long time and still don't sleep well. And then, I'm always reminded something's wrong with my brain, because whenever I work out really hard, I get nauseous and get a headache. And I'm talking, I can't get over 80% anymore. So there's some sort of permanent brain damage in my brain, but it's hard to know what exactly it is.
Yet you still went on and got a PhD, and now you're one of the nation's experts in CTE and TBI. So how did these events shape the work you do now?
Well, I couldn't believe, once I did learn what a concussion was, and met a lot of that through Dr. Robert Cantu, who's my co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. I feel like I was in on a secret. Suddenly I was like, oh, concussions do matter, and all of us athletes are out there banging our heads with no idea what the consequences can be. Somebody should try to change that. And Dr. Cantu encouraged me to try, with my modest platform I had as a WWE superstar, to try to raise awareness and say, hey, it doesn't have to be this way. It turns out we should take concussions seriously, and there might be long-term effects, and let's just educate everybody and give them better medical treatment. And so that's what started the idea, and became a book called Head Games Football's Concussion Crisis in 2006. But what was interesting about it wasn't just the simple issue of educating people. Turns out that there was a business we were coming up against, and really led by the NFL, which has now been well chronicled, that they were trying to bury the concussion issue and bury the issue of long-term symptoms, because it was a risk to their business. And so we were living through a big tobacco type of situation. And so it became suddenly much more interesting than just, passing out information. It became, okay, we're fighting for the survival of athletes and veterans and sports in general, against people with interests that are more focused on the bottom line.
Right. And now to zoom into your personal experience, how did it affect you, knowing that your professional wrestling career came to an end suddenly and unexpectedly because of this injury?
It was hard. It was a hard transition. I had visions of headlining WrestleMania and spending the next 10 years of my life traveling the world with some of the most interesting people and putting on putting smiles on faces, as they say. And it was all just sort of ripped from me. And I could have probably gotten past more easily the change in life had it not been for the daily pain. Living with constant headaches, living with all the things that come with a brain injury, and not wanting to be around people, not wanting to do anything. I wouldn't trade my mid-20s with just about anybody. They were rough, and I wouldn't want anyone else to go through that.
You know, my husband, as you know, is a former Harvard football player as well, and he was telling me he came from a community where football was the main attraction. You know, they all just focused on football, and he said, you know, I got my bell rung, and I remember you just have all the fans watching, and you can't take a knee or go out of the game. So I
Right.
hear that, and as someone who specializes in working with veterans, I think about how that would be in the combat theater when you're dealing with life or death stakes, and you know the odds of getting treatment or getting evacuated to really deal with what's going on are slim to none. So you know we hear about concussive injuries for athletes and veterans in the news. What are the similarities and differences between how TBI occurs and has an impact across these two groups?
So some of the important similarities, involve, we know they happen in sports. They happen from collisions or falls. In military service, we think of injuries in theater, blast injuries, but the data says really most of the injuries are happening not in theater, but in training, in motor vehicle accidents. But the reality is, when you serve, there's a good chance you could suffer a concussion, and in how you suffer it will sort of determine the odds of you actually getting diagnosed. Sports and the military share that culture that you don't want to let your teammates down, you don't want to let the people around you down. And so neither group has an incentive to raise their hand in the middle of a battle or in the middle of a training and say, I'm concussed, I deserve to go sit there and sleep on that bed while you guys continue this battle. And so part of the education that needs to be the same in both groups and that we focus on is that with athletes, we try to tell them, you're not going to help your team if you're out there playing with a concussion. You're going to be slower, you're going to have reaction time issues, and you could lose the game. And I don't know if that message has penetrated as much into the military, that I'm not there, but the idea that the stakes are even higher there when you're hurt, to actually take care of yourself, because by taking care of yourself, you're taking care of everybody else. You don't want to be out with a loaded gun or driving a car with people counting on you when your brain's not 100%.
Right. Yeah, I think that's well put. What can you tell us about innovative interventions that are going to be coming down the pike here for those who have had TBIs?
Well, unfortunately, the brain is hard to fix. And so what's exciting is that because of the increased attention, there's way more investment in therapies and treatments. Right now, there's about 5 things that have medical evidence to get you better when you have sort of post-concussion syndrome, modest brain injury, including lots of types of rehabilitation, visual rehabilitation, balance, physical therapy, because a lot of times the chronic pain from a head injury can often be due to neck or other soft tissue issues. So you want to be an active patient when you've had a brain injury of any sort, because the doctors can't tell by looking at you and often by testing you what's going to work. As science moves forward, we're going to get better at diagnosing what's your unique problem. What part of your brain is actually hurt worse than the others? What do you need to compensate on? Do you need certain cognitive therapies? Do you need other support that is part of your brain overactive that's causing anxiety? Or there's so much that could go wrong that we have a lot of work ahead of us to find out how to fix each symptom that can be caused. But the days are coming where we actually have objective measures of what's wrong with your brain, and then we'll have better measures for how do we treat it, and potentially even drug therapies.
And someone who's been through this with lived experience has a unique perspective on this, as well as your professional expertise. What do you think are some of the major myths and misperceptions that people have about TBIs?
There's a wide range. There's the conservative end where people think you don't have a brain injury unless you're knocked unconscious for a significant period of time. There's the other end of the spectrum that with all this work on CTE, people are worried one concussion and I'm going to develop CTE, which the evidence says is not the case. Peers need to, for it to have any sort of risk that we've seen, you need to have a lot of hits to your head, potentially hundreds or thousands over a period of time. So one of the other myths and one of the other hopeful messages is that, the damage that you do is not necessarily permanent. And someone who sort of keeps getting a little bit better every year for the last 15 years, you will make incremental gains over time. And it's important to keep hope because your brain will always learn to compensate for the problems that have been created. And so it's a magical enterprise. And so, have faith that better days are ahead and that your recovery will continue to evolve over time.
Well, thank you, Chris. Any last thoughts before we let you get back to apparently the paradise-like setting you're in right now?
It's always nice to come visit your in-laws with your wife. I encourage that. Family is very important. But no, as a parting message, you only have one brain. Take care of it. And if you're like me and you've damaged it, don't lose hope. Keep fighting the good fight. Be an active patient. Believe that better days are ahead. And we're out here at the Concussion Legacy Foundation, not always sitting outside relaxing, but working hard to develop advanced science and develop therapies that can help.
Thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for joining us today. Chris Nowinski.
My pleasure. Thank you.